You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Today is Tuesday, October 27, 2020, and I'm here today talking with my colleague, Dr. Jayme Lemke. Jayme, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, so let's just dig in. I wanted to ask you about if you could tell us a little bit about how you became an economist and then how you became a broad economist rather than a narrow technical economist, a more broad and interdisciplinary economist, and kind of what's your origin story?
Yeah. So I think I have a little bit of a different path to economics than many. So as a college student and even as a teenager, I'd always been really, kind of the reflective, booky, alone in my room kind of type, and just fascinated by this experience of being human and kind of these big life questions like, why are we here? What makes a worthwhile life? What does it mean to do, well for other people and by other people? And so that's kind of the big picture background. So because of that, I was always drawn towards literature and towards artistic expression. And, as you know, I wound up studying classical piano as an undergraduate. I'm enormously grateful I had that experience because, I'll try to, give some reasons why a little bit later, but I do think it gave me a slightly different view and also a different attitude on working. Because if you're going to succeed in music, you just have to work enormously hard. Yeah. And everybody who's there studying music is because they had to prepare well enough to be able to audition and get into this music school. So they're all kind of serious. So I had the gift of going through college and taking my studies very seriously. And I don't know if everybody gets that. Sometimes it takes people longer. Anyway, so I don't know. I will tell the good part of the story in just a second. I don't know if I ever told you the first bad part of the story, which is that my first economics class was terrible. Like, just truly horrible. And so my first impression of economics, because it was taught by a guy, he was a full-time professional and he was just adjuncting, teaching this 3-hour night class, and he downloaded the publisher's PowerPoint slides and he would put them up in front of the room and read them.
Yeah.
Wouldn't even explain or talk, just literally just read them. I'm like, I can read, been doing it for a while. Don't really need this.
Yeah.
So my initial attitude, because I know you've talked before about, kind of having your eyes opened by supply and demand kind of thing and being immediately seduced by economics. But, my first impression was more like that's, you're talking about the hamburgers and diminishing margin, that's really cute, the guns and butter and everything. But I think I saw, what was useful about it is being so intuitive that my reaction was kind of like, do you really need a chart to tell you that if more people want something, the price is going to go up? Right. Like, wasn't that just obvious from the beginning? So then it wasn't until I started to appreciate the way in which standards of living and our experiences with each other on the planet are kind of man-made. And, of course, we're all relatively privileged growing up in the United States. We grow up in wealth and with so many of our needs provided. So I think it's when I started to understand that wasn't the case everywhere. And the reason it wasn't the case everywhere is because people were being intentionally held back. And I really started to realize that through this comparative economic systems class I took. And their supply and demand wasn't just like the cute thing on the blackboard, but instead it was illuminating the market process and how that impacted people's lives. And I just remember learning about the Soviet Union and just feeling kind of heartbroken that there were so many people who were trapped and suffering, and it seemed to be for no good reason, just for political glory. And now I understand the ways in which it's dysfunction also, and not just power seeking, although that's part of it, of course. And so I think I'm still, largely motivated by that it's kind of heartbreaking that there's all this suffering and all this suppression, and it's for a lack of a lack of real economic understanding about the fact that markets have this very holistic role in people's lives. And so the other thing there is that, in addition to being heartbroken about the Soviet Union, I read Hayek for the first time. This is Bob Lawson's comparative economic systems class. And I still remember reading The Use of Knowledge in Society. And I think, a little later, maybe a year or two later, I read The Constitution of Liberty. And so in addition to being heartbroken by the suffering, just also being awestruck by what the market could do. Yeah. And this argument about the creative potential of the market, and just like the frustration of the fact that there's so much creative potential and that politics can just reduce that to nothing.
Yeah. I think we've all had our share of bad teachers, so we do know that. It's fascinating when you can overcome it and when you can't overcome it. So I think I'm the type of person that if I would have had that experience that you had, I probably wouldn't have taken the next class in economics, right? And so by the time that I had my teacher that stood up and literally opened up the textbook and read the chapters to us, just like you're talking about, they stood at a podium and opened up their textbook and said, chapter 2, and then started reading. I was already so into it that I was like, this is just stupid. Let me just get through this class, kind of thing. But I had another professor that I found completely unacceptable, and I just boycotted him. And that was really hard to do in a 4 faculty member department, because I ended up by having, like, one year I had a professor that I found, to be good. I had him for 3 hours in a row because I had the 50-minute class, 50-minute class, 50-minute, because I took them for different sections that they were offering rather than take the other guy. So it was like I heard the same lecture over and over again, kind of thing. I think it's unfortunate. Did you have that experience at all in music, or is there something about economics education that sometimes invites that, as opposed to like what you had with music or art history or anything like that? I mean, I don't know if there's an answer to that question. I'm just wondering if the subject matter sometimes is presented boring because people find it boring. Whereas there's a great line in Pagoo where he says that if I want inspiration, okay, I would go to religion or to art or to philosophy. I wouldn't turn to economics, but I turn to economics because I want to solve social problems. So it's because of poverty, ignorance, and squalor that Pagoo is willing to learn and go through the hard work of learning economics, but not because he finds what you said, the beauty and other kinds of things like that. I remember when I read that the first time, I was like struck, like, well, I guess I wouldn't have liked meeting Pagoo because, he doesn't find economics fascinating. But at the same time, I kind of understand it because, like, my oldest son is a musician and involved in art promotion and, and different kind of things like that, art entrepreneurship kind of ideas, promoting different artists. And he's really smart kid, but he found economics boring, like compared to like the other things. So I'm just wondering if you thought there's something about that.
Yeah, I do think that there is something different. I certainly had music teachers who were bad, especially before college in high school. Like I remember I had a private instructor one time who would sit there and flip through a magazine while I was playing instead of paying attention. Yeah. But you can, as you can become an economist without ever developing the skill of being able to connect with other people over ideas.
Right.
You can succeed in a very kind of blackboard way and still find gainful employment. I don't know if you can keep yourself fed as a musician if you can't find a way to connect with other people over your music. Yeah. So I think maybe it's a part of the healthiness of the discipline, which makes it a safer career choice, but it means that not everybody is necessarily going to be required to become a good teacher and to connect it.
A good communicator. I want to ask you a question that, again, is a little weird about this background idea, only because I think that the way that you described yourself as a teenager is fascinating, because it seems like you were painting a picture of the world, and then the science fills in the different parts of the picture, but you always had a picture. And so that relates also to the seeing the big picture about the wealth and poverty of nations, and then painting in the particulars about a supply and demand curve. So rather than building from the ground out, it's from the big picture in. Do you see it that way? And do you think you retain that?
Yeah, I don't think that way of doing it is necessarily better, but I do think it's true that for me, science is the thing that's useful towards helping you understand, and what's important is the world and the human experience. And there are other people who are more animated by the technical development of the science itself. And I would never say that doesn't have value also.
Yeah.
So obviously there's I think some of your other questions might raise this point also, but of course there is a danger maybe in doing science in a way that's too disconnected from the relationship that theory might have to the world. There is this kind of interesting thing about theory of, it is, obviously people can, do and pursue pure science because people can do whatever they want. But as a social scientist, what you say might not always be what's heard. So
Yeah.
how much responsibility does the scientist have over what is heard? Or is it okay to just say back, oh, well, that wasn't my intention with the theory, so I don't have to worry about that?
It's I didn't mean to ask you about this, but as a classical pianist, as you were trained, I just listened to a pretty interesting interview that was linking to a TED talk, but this was an NPR interview with this guy who has written a kind of definitive history of Jonathan Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And the pianist who first performed that almost lost his entire career, by doing it. People were just like freaking out, like, what the hell is this guy doing to his career? It's 1950s, so it's like a very bizarre time and everything. But then this guy explained what Cage was trying to do with it, which is to make you be aware of the sounds that are around us at all time by having the sounds from on the stage be muted or non-existent. That would then see us to be able to hear the sounds. And like, once he started telling it, you realize that in every kind of construction, even a construction of nothing, there's like a big picture that they're trying to do. So, it's not just like, composers sit down and start with a note and then build from the note out. They have an idea of what they're trying to capture. There's something they're trying to capture. And I think it's the same with like painting. It's not like Jackson Pollock. If what Jackson Pollock did was just stand in the middle of canvas and spin around, any of us could do it, right? But like, he had something that he was trying to do. And I keep on thinking about this parallel between scientists and artists, because I think that science is much more artistic than we give it credit for, and that art actually is more logical and whatnot than we often recognize it as. And it's that interaction effect between these things that I think, and I think really, really good political economists historically have this creativity and this construction all going on. And I know that's probably weird for most people to think about because they're like, what the hell? But yeah, yeah. So anyway, we can go down the wrong path if I keep on pushing you on this, but I think
I think you raised an interesting question about intelligibility, though, because especially if you're doing more more contemporary art, I'm more familiar with the musical space and with visual art, but I assume that similar dynamics apply. Like, you can go and listen to, jazz in the modern day has taken on a lot of kind of contemporary art music influence in some spaces. And so, if you are unfamiliar with that language, you can go and listen to it and get just absolutely nothing out of it.
Yeah.
And listen to the performance and think of like, what are these? It just sounds like noise to me. Yeah. So it's this issue of, have you listened to, and understood enough of what comes before to be able to speak that language? Yeah. Or is it like you're going to a talk and the talk is in a foreign language, but you evaluate it as if they had been trying to speak English or something? So, and I think it's the same kind of thing in being able to communicate your research or about economic ideas too, is that you have this, well, you don't have to do it, but if you want your more sophisticated ideas to get off, you have to be able to communicate the foundations as well. Yeah. And obviously there's a kind of a lack of a common economic language or vocabulary about markets. There's, in some sense, those fundamentals are missing from our popular discussions in politics and about, markets and the economy.
I mean, I'll mention Paul Samuelson favorably here, which is not something I always do, but one of the things that he argued created the biggest confusion in the world in this discourse is when you use the same words to mean different things and different words to mean the same thing. And if you think about a lot of the debates that take place and confusions, it does have that in its roots. I don't think Samuelson's answer to that was the correct one, but I do think that there's something very serious about that. But let me ask you a question that gets to your work now rather than your background, which is that, so you've actually tackled lots of different problems in your career as an economist, and you've used lots of different methodologies. So if you think about like the early work that you did with Bob, that's pretty standard approach to how you measure the consequences of a policy or whatever. You've worked with Tyler Cowen and actually were part of a kind of a significant debate going on at the time that was in the New York Times and stuff. And you learn how to communicate economics in a way that, very early in your career, actually. You've done work with Chris Coyne, you've done stuff with myself, you've done stuff independently with other graduate students under your supervision. So tell us a little bit about what you think are the important lessons that you've learned methodologically and analytically from this sustained effort in research.
I do think that an important commonality among all these methods, because Bob Lawson does empirical economic freedom research. So we did a project that was connected to that and that was using cross-country econometric analyses. And so I kind of learned that process. I did other independent studies with Thomas Stratman, and then most of the other work since then has been in either history of economic thought or analytical narrative in economic history has been the primary method that I've used. But all of these, I think that the main common connection between them is that any of them can be done well and any of them can be done poorly. And the ugly reality is that the majority of scholarship is sloppy regardless of what method is being chosen. So, I mean, I don't mean that to be overly negative. I think good scholarship is hard. So we just have to work hard at it in order to get past that.
Yeah.
I used to think that analytical history was more difficult than other methods. And I do think, like all methods, it has its unique challenges. But I've kind of come now to believe instead that it's just that doing history well is more difficult than doing a sloppy data analysis. Like you can do, quantitative analysis the easy way, where you download a prefab data set and just play around trying to come up with some regression method that it has not yet been applied, or question that has not yet been asked using that data. So obviously that's kind of the easy route and the limiting route, because then you pre-limit yourself according to what data is available.
Yeah.
But yeah, regardless of what method you kind of want to use, doing the hard work of starting with the question and then going to look at the historical record. Because, by the way, that, you know, I know this is not like news to you, but I sometimes find it a little surprising when people make too much of the difference between history and data, because they're the same thing. It's just,
Yeah.
you know, it's just a different recording method. The data is, you know, one way that you can record something that has happened in history.
Yeah.
You know, putting the question before the method, I think regardless of your method of choice, is something that in my experience I've found to be important, and to make, especially if you want your research to be interesting.
Yeah, and it's a big pitfall for people who limit their questions to what they think the data gives them. So it's the opposite. It's interesting that so I want to get you to talk a little bit about the archive stuff and maybe the analytic narrative leading into social history kind of connection in your work. But you know, when you were talking about good work and bad work, I recently started rereading and thinking about some work from Willard Quine in a book called The Webs of Belief. And he has an argument in there that I think I understand. I've been trying to confirm it with other people that know more about philosophy than I do, but it's basically argumentative virtue. What he means by that is learning, I take it to mean learning what arguments can cross a very difficult bar that would switch the burden of proof, right? So you think about it like you come into a set of arguments in which someone has the burden of proof on them, and you have to meet an argumentative test, have an argumentative virtue, such that your argument is going to be enough that it shifts the burden of proof the other way again. And most people are unwilling to do the work to do that. And so this is one of the reasons why they either don't challenge the existing status quo or convention, they just go along with it. That would be the normal science. Or they become too satisfied themselves by their own answer, and they don't worry about changing the debate. And again, you know, I might be totally wrong about how I understand Quine and everything like that, but I remember Buchanan constantly trying to get us, as when I was a student, trying to get us to understand that you had to steer a path between the arrogance of the eccentric, right? And this goes back to your position earlier, where I don't have to try to convince anyone because I have the truth all right here in my noggin, you know, kind of thing. Or the position that whatever everyone else is saying must be true, so I'll just go along to get along kind of idea. And this is his dare to be different. You have to somehow negotiate these paths. And what you were saying about the recognition that multiple methods, I think, can all be both good and we can learn from them, and they can be bad. That's actually kind of a fascinating revelation, which is hard, I think, for people that become vested in a methodology. So you wrote a paper about the science wars. And before I get to my next question, talk a little bit about that paper, maybe.
Oh gosh, I have to remind myself get myself back in that frame of mind.
I don't mean to but I'm just fascinated by this recognition of what we consider to be science, who controls it, how we challenge it, how we negotiate, while at the same time not saying that there's only one way to do it. I mean, it's very, well, I'm going to bring this up shortly, but I mean, this is a very Lynn Ostrom kind of position, right? Which is that we have multiple methodologies. We need to be more flexible, but more excellent, I think, on all margins. So this is just.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's an interesting, so the science wars issues is about, you know, what counts as science and how objective is science actually, and you know, what can we know and what can we accomplish using scientific methods. And so I think part of that, you know, without going into too much detail on it, I think part of the motivation there in that paper, and one of the things that I took away from it, and actually have taken away from a lot of my other research as well, is an increasing desire to be, more and more humble about what it is that I think that I can understand. Yeah. And so, in general, I think, since we've been talking about methodology, I think that subjectivism is in relatively scarce supply within the social sciences, and even in economics, where it's supposed to be, kind of sacrosanct. And so we, mentioned subjectivism when we lay out the methodological propositions, but then, a lot of utilitarianism and insertion of, expert values and values that the analyst actually gets implicitly done when it turns to deciding what questions are worth asking and what information is relevant. So I think, part of the science wars has to do with, post-positivist philosophy. And, I don't know if we want to go too far down that road today, but I think in general, the challenge from that perspective, to not fall into the traps of scientism. I don't know if it's always taken quite as seriously as it would be valuable to take it.
Yeah. We end up by becoming suffering from scientism in our criticism of scientism. So I'm going to ask you one other question, not on the post-positivist philosophy, but on the point that you just made about humility, because I think that is really fascinating. Do you see a relationship between the first point that you mentioned, which is about not the first point, but when you talked about the recognizing the awe and beauty of these patterns that exist, and humility, that is sort of, so the once we recognize the complex beauty, it's really hard to then not be humbled in front of it, right?
Yeah, you'd think so. There's the allure of cleverness too, though.
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of people are attracted to, the social sciences because they want to, understand the mystery of the world kind of thing, maybe the overly rhetorical way to talk about, but then there are some people also that, actually, whether you start out this way or not, I think the structure of academia kind of encourages people to become pontificators. Yeah. And you're given this job where it's like, okay, we're going to pay you. And if you're in economics, it's a pretty good salary, but we're going to pay you to stand up in front of young minds and impart your brilliance, and feel free to just stand there and talk free form for 10 to 15 hours a week. And, it's like, do I have 10 to 15 hours worth of, thoughts that are worth,
yeah,
the rest of the world needing to have, if you're really humble about it, I don't know. So I mean, I think that's the difference between stepping back and approaching teaching as more of a conversation and kind of figuring out, where people are, and be able to dialogue with them using your knowledge, from a position of where they are, and just being the pontificator. And there's a huge reward for pontification in economics.
Yeah. No, it's I love that. I actually think the best thing that ever happened to me in my life was marrying my wife Rosemary, and she's my best friend, and going back to when we were kids and everything. But I also think one of the things that she has always done is keep me very grounded. So, she's much smarter than I am. When we first met, I knew that right away, that she was much smarter. And so she calls me when I try to think that I'm so damn clever, about everything. And I think that makes that's pretty, and I probably still suffer from, I'm so damn clever that I can criticize scientism, and damn it, I in fact am so clever, I'm the practitioner of scientism. This is what you were just talking about. It's like, I can tell you how to fix things. So that's pretty great. I think that's a really important lesson about learning to check ourselves and recognize, but it goes back to earlier what you said, is that teaching, when it's done correctly, is a two-way conversation.
I don't want to sound holier than thou, because obviously I'm enjoying hearing the sound of my own voice right now, and I have my own, points that I want to make and convince people of. But just to make, one last connection here before we move on, I think this issue of taking a more humble and a more subjective approach is actually part of the reason why questions related to women's rights have been overlooked often by people who study the market. And I think implicitly there's, because I think many people who do study the market kind of share with me this view that, the poverty and oppression are these great injustices. Yeah. And so, it's kind of a short walk from there to thinking that, measured quality of life and the level of wealth are these kind of, priorities in a class of their own that stand apart from other kinds of social concerns we might have. And so I think then it's very easy to kind of disregard some of what's happening under the surface and to decide as the analyst that kind of the level of wealth in this society is going to be more important than, equality and how universally the rights are distributed within that society and what kind of values and opportunities the entire population has. So it's easy to slip into kind of, ugly utility monster version of utilitarian thinking without being fully aware that you're doing so. Yeah. And so I think that that's part of kind of my hobby horse is to try to make this case that, if you do an analysis that doesn't take, oppression and rights violations seriously, you're effectively offering us, an account of men's property rights. Yeah. Rather than of property rights for that society. And, in doing so, you're really missing the big picture. Women's rights aren't they aren't a special topic.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great, it's a great lead into the next series of questions that I want to ask you about, but I also think I've become painfully aware of this. I think that one of the issues is presentism. So since we're arguing today about how things are, we tend to forget how horrible things might have been in the past. And as a result, we then have a disjoint between the past and the present that we don't recognize, because in the present, formally, it doesn't seem like we have these impediments. So therefore, we've overcome whatever it might be, and that's in the distant past rather than at any kind of thing. And so again, like one of the shocking things in your own work on women's rights, or the work that you and I and Pete did on, the wife sales and divorce and all of that, is just how screwed up the property rights were that limited people's ability of their range of choice and what they had to do in that. And so then, what do you actually mean by choice in these environments and stuff? But maybe, you can talk about that if you want, but I wanted to ask you about your work on the basis of sex, on exploitation of the weak by the strong, and how do you personally balance normative and positive and scholarship and advocacy on those issues? Because, your work has been award-winning work. That award-winning work was actually for understanding the evolution of something rather than the idea of judging that evolution, right? That was just a pure piece of history of understanding how that came about in development with respect to women's rights. But obviously, there's a reason why we want to focus, like you just said, on some of those things. But also, you just made a really good point about the utility monster coming in, about, think about, the history from the 17th century into the 20th century that we focus on, about the rate of economic growth and the betterment of everyone like that. We tend to, and the more we focus on the macro effects of that, the less we actually think in terms of the advancements that you're talking about. So go from there. How do you balance these things? How do you approach it? Where do you think is our biggest blind spots today?
Yeah, just briefly on your point about history, this is a point that, many people from different, areas of study and ideological camps have made, but, Don Lavoie, I think, makes this point persuasively in national economic planning. He emphasizes the fact that, so much of our discussion of American history does overlook the treatment of Native populations. It overlooks slavery. It overlooks, disabilities and women's rights. And one of the, interesting things about the contemporary conversation around liberalism is that these things have become entangled in a way where people now think that those acts of violence and oppression are part of liberalism, rather than recognizing that those are like the failures at that time to have implemented liberalism, a vision of liberal equality. So, I mean, clearly there's I have like a little bit more scientific point to make, but just first, I do think, on the advocacy point, I don't consider myself doing advocacy, although maybe I will at some point, I don't know. But I mean, clearly I do have, a personal motivation in this, in the sense that I care deeply about it. And it was fairly shocking as because I grew up without the hint of an idea that my gender made me lesser or would disqualify me from anything. And then so to learn how pervasive patriarchy has been historically and still is around the world, I think it was kind of a fairly shocking moment. And then, over time, I have seen, a failure to address those questions with respect to, gender and race and caste and all forms of, group-oriented oppression as something that is kind of missing, in our contemporary conversation. So yeah, I guess advocacy maybe in the sense of trying to carve out some scientific space for these and to try to make the point.
And all the more tragic, right, Jayme, and the people that profess to have liberal virtues and whatnot, that should be something that, because if they see liberalism as a long, hard-fought struggle for the expansion of rights to individuals against the group oppression, both in the private sector and the public sector, then those issues should not have been so easily pushed aside or negotiated, in the sense that, I mean, one way to question this is whether or not you think that the coupling of liberalism and these earlier oppressions is a consequence of collectivist thinking, or a consequence of liberals having bad expressions about the way they did things. And I think one of the interesting ways in which you're pushing the conversation is for us to critically self-reflect on what aspects of our own argument have not communicated the incompleteness of the liberal revolution, as opposed to just stressing the other aspects. I'll say one. I read a book this summer by Emma Griffin. I don't know if you've read it. She's a social historian. It's called Liberty at Dawn, and it's about the Industrial Revolution, its impact on the everyday people in England in the 19th century. And what she does is she recaptures it based on letters and various personal histories that people tell and things like that. So it basically covers, basically 1800 to 1890, kind of going on. And when you read it, it's amazing how much life has improved for the average Joe, right?
Yeah, and you asked if it's a failure of collectivist thinking or a failure of liberal thinking, and just from a practical perspective, if you care about these ideas, you can't leave the responsibility with others to articulate your own message. So to the extent that there's a misunderstanding, whether it's fully true or not, I think the productive way to think of that is as a failure, to have kind of fully articulated our own project, and to have, I think also to acknowledge that there are legitimate errors in the project to the extent that these things have been considered trivial.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about your own approach to power and try to augment sort of Austrian economics, public choice economics, to put power more at the center, and how that then relates to issues related to race and gender and sexual orientation,
Yeah. So the special issue just came out of the Independent Review, where I have there's a symposium in there on polycentricity, and I wrote a paper for that on, it kind of brings out these ideas about consent in the liberal tradition, and trying to understand how it is that political systems shape the types of consent that are available to us. And so specifically, there's been this challenge of social contract theory that, social contract theory can be used as a description of what happened historically, or it can be used as this a theory against which we can evaluate alternative existing institutional structures. I think the latter is more useful. But for both, there's this criticism been offered that so often in existing political systems, the social contracts, meaning the rules by which we are engaging with each other politically and socially, have been created just by a segment of the population, with violence used to require obedience by the rest. So then to call that some kind of liberal ideal is, of course, a pretty grievous error. But I do think power is at the core of political economy, and it's at the core of public choice economics. I think we say it so often we don't hear it, but the title of Buchanan and Tulloch's book is The Calculus of Consent. It's looking at this question of individuals freely engaging in interaction with each other. And so I guess in terms of something unique or different that I've tried to bring to that project, bringing explicitly into that conversation the fact that the rules for consent have often been different according to characteristics like gender and race, seems to me to be kind of obvious. So, that's why I like to talk and write about it, to invite challenge on that, so I can hone my understanding of exactly why that is and how it operates. But I think if we view our institutions as being the outcomes of negotiation that take place between different types of interests within particular systems of rules, then understanding the ways in which those rules have been very different for different people seems to me to be a critical part of the project. So I think looking at the ways that market opportunity and that democratic organization that allows people to really participate in the crafting of their own rules, the way that can actually open up spaces for people whose interests are not currently being well represented, I think is very important to understand right now, because the alternative is the scientific expert control alternative, right, of we need to have an expert step in and readjust our institutions in order to accommodate for those people. But that doesn't actually give those people their own voices. Yeah. It's through, enabling, disadvantaged groups, which, the composition of those is going to be different depending on the place and the time you're talking about. But it's about giving the disadvantaged groups the space to be able to create and take advantage of their own opportunities. And I think, both markets and democratic organization are critical to that.
Yeah, I was just thinking while you were talking that this is why the polycentricism stuff and self-governance is such an important aspect of what you're talking about, but also that libertarianism is its own form of legal centralism. And the reason is that it is grounded in the idea of the non-coercion or non-aggression. So it rules out, and by ruling out, it ends up by not allowing us to understand how it is that we could ever come up with rules to do it. So it just declares there is a right and wrong of compulsion by the state. And so if you're on this side, there must not be any power being expressed because we've ruled it out of court, as opposed to, on this side, then it's all power and all aggression, and it has a single source of it, which is the state. And I think that by somehow not falling into that trap, it's kind of like the same thing that Buchanan falls into with the veil of ignorance, right? You're not going to have any kind of bargaining from a known position if all of us are drained of where our known position is. And so therefore, don't we have rules that just, have no embedded, power structures in them, rather than the idea that Pete got to choose the rules for basketball and chose that everyone could only be 5'7" except for him, right? Kind of idea. And then I would be able to be the king of basketball or whatever. And yeah, so it's you raise a really good point. And I like this last point that you just raised about how do we effectively give voice to the disadvantaged. Do you have like case studies or anything that you would point to as critical examples?
Vivian, since this is economic sociology motivated in part, Viviana Zelizer has some, her work has some interesting connections to this. But I think that there are just millions of examples, especially I'll take the economic opportunity one first. One of my favorite examples is Susan B. Anthony, so I think we often think of her as a suffragist, but she has an earlier history as an advocate of reform in women's property rights and trying to generate some equality in that regard, because at the time marital property was entirely under the legal control of the man in the husband-wife relationship. And so Susan B, she grew up with a father who was both a Quaker and an entrepreneur. So as you probably know, the Quakers have a history of being really active in abolition.
Yeah.
So I think there was a little bit of an ideological setting there in terms of her, thinking of social reform and equality as something that, it's worth fighting for, and respecting the equality of all persons. But one of her father's entrepreneurial ventures also was as the owner of a textile mill, two different mills at different points in time, actually. And so the textile mills in American history, they were significant employers of women, and one of the kind of few non-domestic work opportunities that would have been available to women at that point in time. And so as a young girl, she interacted with these women who had come to work at the textile mill. And she reports this in her autobiography as being kind of the source of her confusion as to why it is that women should face legal disabilities over their economic control, because it was clear to her that these women were intelligent and perfectly capable of managing their own finances. They did not need to be managed by a man. And I think that if you look through the history, economic opportunity allows us to see people doing things that we before did not think that they could do. And so it's, of course, it's about the money too, because money allows you to get kind of physical independence. You can afford to move away from people who are not treating you well. but it's also about the way that, economic opportunity can change our ideas about what we and others are capable of.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the thing that I have in mind.
Yeah. I wonder if, so Virginia Woolf wrote a really, fascinating, little essay called a Room of Her Own, and it was about women and being able to have a room of her own, be able to have independence and stuff like that. I think she claimed something like you needed 500 pounds a year or something like that, and you could be, completely. It'd be fascinating to look at that today and see, what has changed in economic opportunity for women, what that has done for their ability to do it, what still could be done, for that. So, it's like a lot of these things, people have been asking these questions for a long time, and answers are still waiting to be had. So it says something about what's going on. All right. Challenges that you've faced in trying to do historical research on social issues. So, this is you've done a lot of this. You've been in archives. You've tried to, as we mentioned before, you've done various different multiple methods. You can think about your travel restrictions as actually giving people economic opportunity that otherwise they wouldn't have had, by having greater ease of travel. And so you've done it in a variety of ways. What are the biggest obstacles that you've faced, both in doing the research and in trying to sell that research in social science journals?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of doing history is that history is not an object there to be discovered. It itself is actually an artifact that has been created by living people who had their own values and their own ambitions.
Their own scripts to write.
Yeah. There's this great little book called What is History? Hopefully I'll remember the author soon, but he has a line in there where he says, it's a dull chap who doesn't have any bees in his bonnet. And whenever he talks about how whenever you're reading something that's been written into the historical record, you better figure out what those bees are.
Yeah.
And so, doing history, what this means is that you really do have to dig deeper, especially if you want to ask questions about those who have not been the victors in history. So especially if you're looking at disadvantaged groups, you have to look a little deeper in order to get accurate information. And there are genuine errors in the historical record, but the even bigger problem is just the lack of information. Which, that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, because then it means that there are legitimately things there to uncover, and that can be quite exciting. But also, if you're doing history on a topic that is distant from your own life experiences, either because it's, outside of your lifetime or in a different part of the world, it can be very easy to misunderstand. And that potential for misunderstanding increases the further away you get. So I remember when I started reading 19th century sources, there were times where I would honestly not know if something was being offered as a point of fact or it was a joke. So you have to kind of do this wide reading in the history in order to learn the context. You have to figure out how to speak that language a little bit. And, when you're looking back at historical sources, some of them are the equivalent of like an academic journal today, and some of them are the equivalent of like, BuzzFeed News or even Babylon Bee or whatever. And so if you don't have enough context to know what it is you're reading, you can wind up saying silly things. So I think, this happens a lot, and we see scholars making silly mistakes by not understanding the historical context, like misunderstanding, a legal term as as being literal rather than metaphorical, things like that.
Yeah.
So taking the time to read widely in the history, it's that challenge and this opportunity, and it's also one of the things that is just really a joy sometimes, because it's like the detective work component of it.
Yeah, we ran into that with the life sales papers and the way different people reacted to what we were trying to say, when really we were trying to look at a world in which people were engaged in indirect bargaining to try to improve their lives. But yeah, but I have an observation and a question I wanted you to comment on, which just dawned on me while we were talking, and what you were just talking about, understanding context and whatnot, which is how varied your own experience has been as a young scholar in this first decade of your career or so, right? Because not only were you an undergraduate at a Midwest liberal arts college, okay, which is a whole different culture itself. You then came to a large state university, right? And you got your first teaching experience at a large state university. Then you taught at an Ivy League blue blood school, probably maybe one of the most of the blue blood Ivy Leagues, because it's not as big of a research environment at Brown as some of the other Ivies. So it's not the same as being where it's all graduate students all the time. I mean, and so then you taught there. Then you went and taught where a place dominated by very particular religious sect of people. And then you back into like secular state university again, teaching. And so from, one of the things we're stressing in the economic sociology is, basically you have economics, economic sociology, and then economic history. And economics is like working out the pure logic of choice. And then, economic sociology is the situational logic, where these choosers are then thrown into environments defined by law, politics, religion, other cultural kind of ideas. Well, you're the teacher and you've been thrown into, and student that's in these different environments. And so therefore the kind of context shifts radically. So in learning, how has that shaped you? And I mean, do you see it that same way that I'm saying about, I find that experience must be amazing in some weird sense, right? It's not the experience that like someone like Jeff Sachs had, right? So, he went to Harvard, then he taught at Harvard, and, now the big move for him is to be at Columbia, right? And, and this is how, I was involved in some selection of a position in the economics profession this summer. And I had the opportunity to go and look at people who had previously held the position, and they're all from the same schools or, schools. And in the end, the woman who they picked, very good choice. So I'm not complaining about the choice, but this was her educational path. She was a graduate student at MIT. She then got tenure at Harvard. Then she got bid away to teach at Stanford, right? I doubt that she's ever taught anyone, like I had at one time, a student stand up when I did the Keynesian multiplier, and then raised her hand and said, so in order to do this class, you have to have an advanced knowledge of statistics. And I said, nope, it's just algebra. Very simple. It's just very algebra. She goes, nope, that's advanced statistics. And I said, no, seriously, you don't need to know any statistics. It's just algebra. She goes, we'll have to agree to disagree. Yeah. And so, okay, how do I communicate? Because I want to communicate. It's not like I want to rule this person out, but you've been in all those different backgrounds, and the background that the students have, like going from Brown to Utah State, and the different tacit presuppositions that your students in Utah State had versus your students in Brown. How did you communicate across them in such a short period of time of talking to them?
Yeah, I do perceive it that way as well. And you're right, those environments, basically every environment I've taught in has been a radically different one. Yeah. And I feel like it definitely gave me a finer appreciation for just how differently the same sentence can be heard in a different room. I mean, even a facial expression, how differently the same facial expression can come across in a different room. So yeah, I think I think I've used that experience to feed into how important it is to take people's subjective experiences seriously.
Yeah.
If you're going to do, work that is intended to interpret them and their interactions with the world, you can't take it for granted. It's just far too easy to forget that we are all and by the way, those were, as different as those were all still university environments.
Right.
The same job, the diversity in the entirety of the world is even so much greater than that.
Yeah.
So I think it's very easy to forget that we are, as academic researchers, all in the same rarefied environment.
Yeah.
And so I do take it seriously that there are things that we could all commonly believe that other parts of the world don't see and don't believe. And we need to figure out a way to access those, or ideally, let those people's actions and words speak for themselves. If we're going to do work that's intended to speak to a world that they're a part of. So hopefully I've used it in that positive way. But I mean, just on a practical level, I definitely learned a lot of that the hard way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's so much to learn from you by actually the fact that you had that kind of jagged past, because there's just so many varied experiences. There's a fascinating book I read when I was a graduate student by Mary Catherine Batson called Constructing a Life. And it's about women and the difference between women and men, and how women have this more rich experience because they have to play these various different roles in their life that men tend not to have to do. And so men are more boring than women, and no one wants to be boring. So, you read this to try to figure out, how can I be more interesting? Rather than, I don't want to be bored. But it's not a self-help book. It's actually, it's a serious book or whatever. But I was fascinated by this idea of trying to communicate economics. And even in your case, right, you're trying to communicate things about property rights and whatnot to these various different audiences. You have a bunch of stuff up in here that I need to get more access to. So I'm fascinated. All right, so I appreciate the time that you spent with us. I have one last question to ask you, which is just for you to talk about what you're currently doing, what keeps you up at night, excites your imagination, and share it with the students. Because part of the whole thing of this is for them to be able to see in the various different scholars that we're talking to themselves, so that they can in fact become owners over their own path, just like you, and be able to let their curiosity drive them. So where are you at the moment, and what are you working on? And by the way, congratulations on that new paper. It's excellent, and everyone should read it and learn from it. But that's done now. So now what's the next thing?
So just real briefly, as a segue into that, one thing that I think was unique about my graduate school experience, because of coming out of music, is that I did not have the same fear of failure that I've seen in many other students, because I never expected to succeed.
Yeah.
Why would anybody think that somebody who'd spent the past 10 years focused on playing, or 15 years focused on playing classical piano, would be able to successfully, become an academic economist and navigate the PhD process. So I think that, not having those kind of expectations, and having had a background where, you're asked to go into a silent auditorium and play Chopin from memory, why would I ever be scared about taking PowerPoint slides into a classroom after that? So that's not to say that I don't get nervous, because I definitely do, still get nervous, because I, care about communicating well and, and being able to accomplish my goals. But I think that kind of freed me up to select my own priorities. And one thing that I say a lot when I'm talking to students is, if you're going into academia, you've already decided you're not here for the money.
Yeah,
Because if you can get through a PhD in econ, you can, make more money a lot easier by being an accountant or going into process management or, many other things. So what are you here for? And so I think that background, as well as just the incredible support I've gotten from the interdisciplinary environment at Mercatus, has really freed me to feel like I can pursue this interdisciplinary project of, how is it that we navigate some of these questions about social justice and the impact of history in a way that enables us to really, kind of get some insight into what it means to, be able to lead a flourishing life and for all of us to be able to flourish. So like this project in the Independent Review is related to this larger inquiry I have into what is it that enables processes of social change to move in the direction of greater freedom and equality. And so I'm doing that looking through the lens of women's experiences in American history. What were the ideas that people held about women's engagement in economic and public life in 1800? And how did we get to such a radically different place? Now, of course, but, even by 1900, because, patriarchy is one of the most enduring institutional types in human history. It has deep connections in the way that states and nations have been organized for just centuries and centuries. And it kind of all blew up in 100 years. Yeah. Following the Industrial Revolution, following, modern experiments in democratic self-governance. And the United States was a leader in that, despite the fact that the United States in the 19th century wasn't a leader in much. Right. It's easy to read the current United States back into history, but we were, a relatively poor nation of farmers with a lot of serious problems and, not a lot of, we were not the progressive center of the world. We can just say that. But you have this just incredible expansion in the opportunities then that were available to women. I haven't looked at as much into the histories of other forms of emancipation, but, these kind of stories you can examine for all kinds of people and for all around the world. So the one I'm doing right now is women in American history, but, my hope is that these examples of liberalism and kind of figuring out what was the process or, what was the context such that this group of people who were, legally, historically, socially disadvantaged were able to accomplish so much. Like it's a modern miracle. It's an incredible success story for human civilization. And I think it deserves to be told and to understood well through processes of economic and political organization, which is why the political economy toolkit is so important for articulating those ideas.
Well, that's a fantastic place for us to stop. I greatly appreciate you taking the time to share these ideas and encourage you to continue on this great research path you're on, because we're all learning tremendously from it. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah, thanks so much, Pete. And thanks for your, for your guidance when I was a graduate student and helping encourage me down this path. It really has meant so much to me. So it's wonderful to talk about it today.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.